everything is in decline for young people. That is what the data is telling us.
But I also wonder how much of that is also the fact that now American youth and Western youth are competing with a very hungry global workforce.
The income growth is going to be happening around the world. We should 100% be increasing minimum wage if it is literally flat against productivity and minimum wage hasn't moved. And I think that is the first sign of a stagnating society that is saying to its people, we don't really care about working hard, and we're not really going to reward it.
I can't remember the last time I heard any politician ask for sacrifice.
The trouble is that politics is a popularity contest, and telling everyone, hey, let's all make our lives a little bit shittier for someone else to have a slightly better life. And so it requires incredibly smart, clear, concise messaging to get people on board with that.
Hey, it's Andrew here, and welcome to the eCommerce Fuel Podcast, the show dedicated to helping 7- and 8-figure brand owners build incredible businesses and equally impressive and amazing lives. And one of my favorite podcasts is the Prof G show and Prof G Markets. And chances are you have heard of Scott Galloway. He has been all over the place on podcasts promoting a new book. And so I wanted to give you something new and fresh and bring the very underappreciated, or at least underexposed in terms of being on other shows, Ed Elson, onto the show to talk about a bunch of different stuff. Ed is the co-host for Prof G Markets and for a lot of things on the Prof G show as well. It's just a sharp, funny, really well-informed guy. Adds so much to the show, and I really enjoyed my conversation with him. So we talk about a lot of the themes they discussed on the show. One of them being the war on the young and kind of some of the influences on that, or what they call the war on the young. We talk about minimum wage, cultural differences between the UK and the US. We talk about big tech and also the need for, kind of a change in political things. This is not a partisan show. It never has been. But I think some things we talk about are pretty important. Anyway, deeply enjoyed the conversation with Ed, and I hope you do too. Quick word of warning, there is a little bit of language here. So if you are driving, 6 kids to soccer practice, may want to pop in the earbuds. And with that, we'll get into it right after this. What do you think the formula is? Like, I have some ideas why I think the show's been so popular and so well done. But what do you like that formula you talk about? What did that end up? What did you try first, and what ended up working better?
So I didn't really know what I was getting into when we started it. I was a big fan of Scott for a while, and started working for him out of college because he was someone that I admired, and my thinking was I should just go try to provide value for someone that I think who I'd like to emulate in some way. So I was doing whatever for him. I was doing some ghostwriting. I was helping him on his decks. And then one day he says, okay, I want to start a podcast. And you'll kind of read the news basically. And I was like, okay, I didn't really know what that would mean. So I'd just read the news. Today, Microsoft did this. And, that was sort of what we did. And I guess it was sort of the Scott show for a long time. But we already have the Scott show in a lot of places. We've got Prof G Pod. Scott is voicing his opinions on Pivot. He's going on TV. He's doing all these talks. You don't really need a guy to just read something off a script. So I think what we kind of figured out is that people want pushback against Scott. He's got these very out there, opinionated, confident ideas, which are very fun to listen to. And I love hearing his takes. But I think what listeners wanted is someone saying, hold on, that doesn't really make sense. You said that, taxes, for example, he's a little bit contradictory about his approach to taxes. He spends all of his time trying to minimize his taxes, but at the same time talks about how, we need to increase taxes on the rich. So how do we actually square that together? And I think what people enjoyed as well is that it's coming from a young person. A lot of what Scott talks about and what we talk about is this generational wealth transfer from the young to the old. And we've put out all this research on that, and that's what Scott's TED Talk was about. So I think what is fun is hearing a young person go back to a boomer and say, well, what do you really mean here? What does that actually mean for us? You're saying this, but do you really believe it? And, we hash those conversations out. So I think that's kind of what we've figured out kind of works. And I'm grateful to him that he's open to having those conversations, that he's down for me to really interrogate him very publicly. And we put everything out there. So I think that's kind of what we're working on right now.
Yeah, that works really well. The different perspectives. You do a good job of that. And I think other things that work well is the chemistry you two have, where you're willing to give him, a hard time. He's willing to bust your chops about stuff. People listen to podcasts partially to learn things, but just as much to be entertained, right? Like, and 100%. You guys have done such a good job of combining those two, and that's a really hard thing to do. So anyway, I think the chemistry works really well with you. Was that how hard was that early on? I mean, you're coming in, you're a super bright guy, super sharp guy.
Thank you.
But still, I mean, you're in your mid-20s, Scott's 60-ish, almost 60. He
says he's 49, but
he says he must be talking to Brian Johnson a lot, be one of those experimental guys. That must have been super intimidating. Maybe it wasn't. For me, it would be hard coming into someone with that much expertise and experience, and that you admired for so long, and kind of like giving a lot of pushback. Was that a hard thing to do out of the gates? Do you have to lean
100%? Yeah. No, I mean, 100%. But I think what you said is exactly right, which is, I think that was probably the big learning for me, is the idea that part of the job isn't just the information and knowing your stuff, but it's also being entertaining. That's been a huge unlock for me on the podcast. I also think it applies to almost every aspect of professional life. I think I spent a long time, and people spend too much time trying to be correct, which is important. I want to make sure I've got my numbers right. They don't spend enough time trying to have fun and enjoy the work they're doing. And that's not just to be kind of trite and, it's, have fun, enjoy your life. It genuinely makes your output better. And just as an example, say you're going into a job interview, I think people spend a lot of time thinking, okay, I need to have the correct answers. I need to make sure that my resume is perfectly crafted. And they don't spend enough time thinking, I need to go in there and make the interviewer enjoy hanging out with me. It needs to be a fun experience for the interviewer, because ultimately what the interviewer wants is, someone who will get the job done, but also someone who you're going to hang out with every day at work. And I think that was a big learning for me. It was a little bit more in my face because we're doing a podcast and the job is to entertain. So you're really thinking, okay, how do I make this fun and engaging for people? But I do think it pervades in every other aspect of life. If you can figure out a way to enjoy yourself while you're doing something, people appreciate that more than you'd think.
Yeah, there's like a baseline of competency. If you're at the interview phase, you're probably, maybe top 15, 20%, maybe 10% of interviews. They've looked at it on paper. They know that you're probably going to be able to do the job. Right. It's just a personality test at that point.
100%.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about. And if you can, this is why it is important to do your homework. You don't want to go, I prep crazy amounts for each podcast. I know I'm not using around 80% of the information that I go into the podcast with. The reason that I do that is, again, not because I want to be correct about everything and not because I want to know everything. It's because I want to feel that I know everything such that I can go in and have fun. Just relax, enjoy it, make it entertaining, let my mind kind of wander. I think that's the way people should be operating at work too. You should know your stuff and be able to walk into work every day and feel confident enough that you can actually relax a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the prep stuff because it's impressive. Without you saying that, I had a strong suspicion that you were putting an unholy amount of hours prepping for this. Because you'll just pull out stats that it seems like you had gone through and read about, 25 10Ks and had digested them with instant recall. I mean, what's your process like for prepping for some of these things? Are you spending just 8-10 hours going through all of the different companies to try to learn? Like, give me a sense of how you're prepping for it and kind of the tools you use too, because you've got some amazing. I mean, I started out in banking, investment banking for a couple of years, and to have some of the tools available now, like just even ChatGPT for putting together decks, would have saved me unholy amount. I mean, just would have been amazing. So I'd love to hear how you think about prepping, and like, you're doing this so regularly, you've got to have a pretty good system for it.
Yeah. I do put in unholy amounts of time researching for these podcasts. I look at Lex Friedman and the way he does his podcast. He has like a stack of papers like this thick. I mean, we're doing a podcast, but several inches thick. He goes, I think most people are going crazy on the research. I think the thing that has really helped me is trying to find the so what in your research. You can know the numbers, but what part of the information do you find genuinely interesting? Something I often ask myself when I'm doing research is, do I care about this? Like, is there some number that's been put out? Some companies reported some earnings, and is my instinct, for some reason I care about that? Or is it just kind of, it's just a number, I don't really care? And I think that's an important thing to focus on when you're trying to tease out insights about why does something matter? Why is it worth even saying? Why is it worth someone taking time out of their day to listen to? People only have so many hours during the day. And I think you really have to focus on, is this even interesting? Is this worth caring about? Is this something that the average person is going to listen to and it's going to affect them in some way? So I'm spending a lot of time reading, 10Ks and 10Qs and earnings reports. But what I'm really trying to find is I'm scanning through and I'm looking for something that jumps out at me as, well, this means something more important than what it just says on the paper. And I think that is a helpful kind of guiding principle, in addition to just putting in the hours and reading all the documents.
Yeah. I think two final things for moving on that I think have been really powerful that you've both done a great job on the show. One is brevity. I feel like brevity is one of the most underrated skills on the planet.
100%.
And the amount of ground you and Scott will cover in an episode is phenomenal. So I think that's something you guys have just completely nailed. The other one is probably one of the biggest things I've taken away in terms of thinking about for myself long-term and in the future is, like, if you ever get to the point where you have economic security, which of course Scott has, he's done exceptionally well, it's your responsibility to really be honest about what you believe about the world, especially if they're controversial opinions. And you guys on the show, I would describe Scott as leftish for sure, but without being afraid to call things out that he thinks are crazy on the left if he thinks they're nuts. And the fact that you're able to have real discussions about things that a lot of people won't touch with a 10-foot pole because of they feel like they might get canceled, they feel like it's not PC. I think people are really hungry for real talk about the real issues of the world that a lot of people don't have. And I think you guys, it's one of the most refreshing things I think about the show.
Yeah. So on the first point, brevity, that's 100% right. Everyone should be trying to figure out how they can be more brief in all aspects of life. People's attention spans are just minuscule these days, and you can complain about it and say that we should be reading more books, but that is the reality of the situation that you have to, get used to. You have to get real about it. So you can't be writing crazy long emails today with paragraphs of the things you expect and what you'd like to think about for the next meeting. You can't do that. I consider it disrespectful to my time to be getting a long paragraph document about what we want to be doing. You need to start thinking in bullet points. You need to make your points concise. If you go on a podcast, I'm trying to do that right now. You should be leaning into short form video to get your marketing across. That's something that you have to be focusing on. We record maybe 2 to 3 hours of footage each podcast. We put out 45 minutes of it because our editor is going in there and clipping obsessively to make it as brief and, information dense as possible. Remind me the second point you said.
I was just saying that the willingness to have hard conversations and the obligation for people who are in a position to have them.
Yes. So my view on this is kind of similar to your point about brevity. We live in a time where, and especially my generation, we have been seeped in an information overload, the likes of which we've never seen in the history of this planet. The amount of podcasts, back in the day, there were, a few radio shows that maybe you tune into, and maybe you'd listen. It's like a 20-minute program that you tune into once a day. There are millions of podcasts, and people have 7, 8, 9, 10, often more podcasts on rotation. You are scrolling through TikTok. You are going on LinkedIn. You're going on Instagram. You're reading the news. The amount of information you are receiving is so crazy that you need to figure out, and people need to figure out, what's going to rise to the top in terms of our attention. What is actually going to animate us? My view is that you have to have an opinion today on everything. Companies, I don't think, focus enough on this. They think, it's our job to be neutral. We'll let our consumers, they can have an opinion. They'll have an opinion, and then we'll react to their opinion. No, if you want anyone's attention today, you have to develop an opinion on something, and it has to be clear, it has to be concise, and it has to be forceful. And I think that that's something that Scott has figured out. I think he gets criticism for it. I think a lot of people get criticism for it. Having a hot take all the time, it can be a little bit sometimes ridiculous. But the reality is, and you don't want to fake your hot take. You don't want to just say a hot take because you think it'll get a reaction out of someone. Sometimes that'll work, but I don't think that has much longevity over the long term. You need to be thinking critically about issues and deciding quick, where do I stand on this? What is my opinion on this issue? Where does someone else stand on this? That's the only way, I believe, that you can get people's attention and you can get people to engage with you in conversation. It's not a great system. It would be nicer if we could be a lot more sort of slower and nuanced about things, and you could be a little bit more ambivalent and take your time. But in this age where you have, a split second to capture someone, you have to be coming in prepared with where you stand.
Yeah, I think attention is really scarce. But what I think is more scarce even than attention these days is well-informed, reasonable conviction about things. And I think that's one of the things, my listening to the show, to you and Scott putting things together, one thing that's made me want to do and also realize I need to do is really pick 5 or 6 issues I care deeply about, dive very deep on them, educate myself really well with real data, and then be able to come back and have very strong convictions of them, especially if they run counter to what kind of people normally think. And I think that's one of the things why lots of people have hot takes. And I actually disagree a little bit. I think having a hot take on everything, most people don't put in the work to be able to have a valid hot take on what they're talking about.
100%.
People just say off the thoughts. And that's why I think people get annoyed with the hot takes and why they lose their effectiveness. But when you put in the effort to really have a data-based opinion and perspective on what you're saying, that's where the power comes from. I think that's what you do on the show really well. Like, all your stuff is always backed with data, and it's, data is the best is the best ally you can have in a contentious argument.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I should say you're right. You can't just have a hot take. It's got to be a hot, good take. It's got to be reasonable. It has to make sense. It has to be clear. It can't be a lie. I mean, again, sometimes you can get away with just lying, but once you get caught, that's sort of it. So you better be putting in the work and doing your homework and making sure that your hot take makes sense and is true, and you believe it and you care about it. All those things are important. I think my point is, and it sounds like we mostly agree on this, is that if you want, whether you are a podcaster or just a regular business or a marketer or a brand, you have to have one. I think some people think they can just sort of tap out. You can, but you'll fail. You won't be able to engage with people in a meaningful way. And I think that's the really important point. But I agree, finding issues and doing the research and thinking them through in a reasonable, honest way is refreshing, and that will capture people's attention more so than just saying the craziest thing you could think of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about, if you're sitting down with friends, or let's say you're sitting down with people, acquaintances that you've just met, you're having dinner, the best, most enjoyable, most interesting conversations are the ones that it's not about the weather. It's not about what what you did this weekend. It's about like real interesting, deep issues that maybe are, that mean something. I have a problem sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes I get so fed up with kind of the surface level talk. I'll dive a little deep too quickly and ask people questions. I live in Montana, and there's a lot of grizzly bears. And so I always have this, for parents, I have this question that's like, hey, if you were hiking in the woods with your spouse and a child, and a grizzly bear comes out, 2 grizzly bears come out of the woods chasing each one of them, and you have a gun, you can only shoot one. Which one do you shoot? And I think it's this super interesting, it's very morbid, of course, but I think it's this question of like, how do you think about like obligations to like someone you love, different people you love? What are your different obligations there? Like, it's a very it explores people's values and judgment calls. And maybe I think it's an interesting, deep question. I have whipped that out within 4 minutes at a breakfast brunch with a couple of people who are on an anniversary trip. And it just, people looked to me like I was a oh yeah, evil villain in the Bond. So I definitely can go south. I advise caution here, but those are like you talk about with an opinion, those are the kind of things like that's what's interesting. That's what matters. And I feel like we need so much more of that. And it's scary to lean into sometimes. And sometimes you get those breakfast buffet moments or brunch moments where people are never going to call you again. But I think it's worth the risk. So
I completely agree. My brother-in-law is you in that aspect. He will, we'll be talking about it. No, it's and I love it because we're talking about bullshit. This is bullshit. No one really cares, and I can see him fidgeting and he's going crazy, and then he says, "What do we think the meaning of life is?" Like it's just, and it's, I think it can be a shock, and he could probably learn to use a little bit more tact and maybe ease people into it, but ultimately it leads to way more interesting places. First you get a little bit of like, well, we're just kind of eating food, so we don't really care. But then, eventually people start tackling the bigger questions. And I really appreciate it. So, I mean, I say more power to you. You're gonna get some people who aren't down to do it, that they they're not ready to question anything in their lives, and that's okay. Maybe you don't want to hang out with them as much, but I think it's great, and I love having those conversations, and that's why I'm very glad that I get to, as a job, just have meaningful conversations. But yeah, I think you're doing it the right way, is what I would say.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll call in on your Q&A line and pose that one to Scott, or feel free to steal it.
Yeah, I would answer, but I don't have a kid, so I can't.
Yeah, I was going to say, we'll have to put this one to Scott and see what he says.
Yeah.
It definitely wouldn't be the most controversial thing he'd answered on the show. A couple of the the narratives, I'd say we have many narratives that you've explored, but a couple of the repeating ones are the war on the young. And then also kind of the crisis with young men. And obviously you fit into both of those demographics. Let's tackle the war on the young first. I mean, you're in a granted a pretty unique position, like, mid-20s, super well educated, on a top podcast in the US. So doing exceptionally well. But that being said, like, looking at your peers, both in the industry, your peers maybe from your childhood days, like, how much are you seeing that resonate, not just in the data, not just, in the quantitative stats that you and Scott are putting together for this, but in your real life, in the real life of your peers? And maybe before you answer that, just to make this a very complex question, if you could maybe tee up the kind of the 2 or 3 basic points about why you believe there is a war on the young, and then if you're seeing that in your real life.
So, what's going on with the war on the young is basically, you just look at the data, which is, for the first time in American history, someone who is 30 or just under the age of 30 is not doing as well as his or her parents were at the same age. And we can look at everything. We can look at obesity rates. We can look at suicide rates. We can look at mental health. We can look at housing prices. We can look at just plain net worth. Everything is in decline for young people. That is what the data is telling us. I look at my life. People seem fine my age. The reason people seem fine my age is because of what you just said, which is, I went to an elite university. All my friends who I hung out with went to elite universities. They got great jobs at big banks and consulting firms, and now they're starting companies, and they're living in New York. And they're spending 40% of their income on rent, because rent in New York is crazy, but they're making a lot of money and they're living in pretty decent apartments. I believe that my bubble is indicative of what is going on, which is, income and brand inequality that is all accumulating to the people who went to a handful of elite universities and who are going to be set up for success. And I think the fact that I'm not seeing in my daily life, in my tiny little bubble in Manhattan, what the data is telling us, and what the data is telling us is scary. To me, that's a real problem. So, in my lived experience, no, but that's because, I, as you said, I've got a great job. I'm hanging out with the Scott Galloways of the world now. And, I went to a great school and everyone is doing well, but the data is not, the data would beg to differ. How we fix that is very difficult to answer. We've been trying to figure out ways that we can tackle that. I think what I believe is that we need to see the older generation, the boomer generation, willing to make some more meaningful sacrifices. I think a lot of that is pretty well exemplified in deficit conversations. I think that old people get very, very sensitive about, they want to take down the Department of Energy and they want to take down the Department of Education. We're spending too much on these stupid 3-letter agencies. That's kind of what the Republican talking points have been. It's what Vivek was talking about. Now Trump's talking about that a lot. They're sort of rah-rah on let's reduce spending in these few areas. But what they forget is that all of our spending is, one, going to defense. And when I say all, I really mean very, very vast majority. I think 60 to 70% going to defense and Social Security. And those two things, they do not want to touch. We need to protect our borders and we need to protect our seniors. We have to do that. But all over here, we're willing to really dig deep and make big, meaningful cuts at all of these agencies. That you're shaving things off. If you want to make a change, you have to be willing to make an actual sacrifice. You need to be willing to, maybe lower the retirement age. You need to be willing to loosen up housing permits and housing policies that may reduce the price of your home. And I know that you expected that your home price was going to go up and that everything was going to be great and you were going to retire comfortably. And I would love for that to happen. But something has to give somewhere. And right now, what we are deciding is that where things are going to give is all going to be for people my age and younger, except, of course, for the people who went to elite universities and who got great jobs, and for people who are going to inherit money. That's the other thing that people aren't talking about enough is inheritance tax. That inheritance tax laws are crazy. The amount of breaks that we are giving to rich kids, it's just one of the craziest political conversations, in my view, that needs to be discussed more.
If you look at some of the stats that you pulled up, and I can't remember if this was in Scott's talk or not, but the amount that we are spending on our older generation relative to our younger generation, I think it's something like 8-1 or 10-1 that we invest in seniors versus our youth. And I think like if you live in a country as prosperous as the United States, dignity for seniors is important, right? Like I think any prosperous nation should take care of the vulnerable or the elderly in their midst. But yeah, I don't, if you're spending 10-1 on seniors versus people under 20 or 25, I mean, you're just like going 70 miles an hour towards a bridge that's out. I mean, the country in 50 years is going to be a train wreck. One thing I remember my boss when I was probably about your age, maybe a little bit younger, even in the finance world. I was sitting with him at an airport. We were talking, and we were reading something.
Investment bank or
investment bank, yeah.
Okay.
And we were reading something in the Wall Street Journal about the fact that you could outsource. Outsourcing was not new, but new-ish. A lot of jobs going to India, call center jobs, things like that. And he made the point. He's like, at some point, these wages have to be equal, right? Like over time, there has to be some kind of, reversion to the mean. And I laughed at him and I was like, no way. Americans and the Western world has a lock on just this certain type of talent or skills. That's never going to happen. And sitting here, 15 years later, I'm looking at that and I'm seeing that happen in so many areas. Most people listening to this are e-commerce store owners. And the number of people I know that have hired exceptionally talented supply chain, director of supply chains out of Mexico for 25% of what they would pay for it in the United States. Yep. I'm seeing that everywhere. And I wonder, I think you're right. I think there's definitely some things, policy decisions we've made domestically with monetary policy, with other policy that has made it, I would not want to be, I think it is objectively harder to be 20 today than it was 20 years ago, for sure, even 10 years ago. But I also wonder how much of that is also the fact that now American youth and Western youth are competing with a very hungry, global workforce. And when you say war on the young, I would say a lot of, you look at youth in China, you look at youth in India, some of these other countries, their opportunities are much more than they were 20 years ago.
Right.
Anyway, thoughts on how much of that is contributing to the fact that it's harder to get ahead in America or Britain or the Western world?
It's an interesting point that I haven't thought about deeply, and I think I will now that you bring it up. One thought that it has sparked, we talk a lot about, I think that what you described about wages and income is true, that you're not going to see much income growth and that the income growth is going to be happening around the world. You're not going to be seeing much income growth in America. You haven't been seeing it. And we talk a lot about the difference between being an earner and being an owner. So if you're an earner, you're getting the majority of your income through, your employer, your salary. And if you're an owner, you're sitting on an asset base. Maybe you're earning some interest. Maybe you're borrowing against those assets, and that's how you're funding your lifestyle. People our generation is too dependent on earning right now. And we have decided through policies that we're going to tax earned income at a higher rate than owned income, than assets, which is crazy and which Scott has talked about a lot. One point that Aswath Damodaran, who is a professor at NYU Stern, made on our podcast, I don't know if this podcast has come out yet, I don't think it has, is that today, if you own the S&P 500, the way that I used to think about this is I'm betting on America. I'm owning an asset in America. And that's what we should be doing, right? Assets, you should be saving your money and investing in stocks, because if you're just getting all your money in cash from income, you're going to get screwed. You have to be investing if you want to keep up, because that's the way our society is set up. Now, the thing that I have thought for a long time is that you're betting on America and you're potentially losing out on all of the growth that you described around the world. So maybe I should be investing in India, in Indian stocks or Chinese stocks or any other country that you mentioned. He made a really interesting point, which is that the S&P 500 today is actually now a global index, because the amount of business that is being done throughout the world at each of those companies, you're kind of getting an amalgamation of every single economy. Amazon does business throughout the world. It's not just, if consumer demand falls off in the US, that's a problem for Amazon, but they're doing their business everywhere else. So if you own the S&P, or if you own American stocks and invest in the US stock market, the thing that should bring you some sense of safety is that actually you're kind of participating in the global stock market too. So all of that growth that you're describing, I think the solution from a practical position for young people, invest in the S&P 500. If wages are going to go up in India and you're going to see increased productivity and increased GDP in India, US stocks will get some of that benefit. And that's the way that you can participate in that. Or you could go buy stocks in those countries, but I don't think you need to worry too much about diversifying in the way that we have probably stressed in the past, because at this point, it's such a global economy. All you need to be focusing on is owning assets, and the US is a good place to start.
It's a fantastic point. I mean, in my very boring index, I'm always 80% S&P and 20% international. And it always annoys me because I'll log in and look, and the S&P is ripping and the international has been just kind of real lackluster the last 5-10 years. And I was trying to do that out of a safety diversification kind of thing, which is important, but that's a great point. I mean, you look at S&P is, probably 40+%, maybe 50% of revenues come from international sources So great point. All right. I'm going to dump all my international, and I'll tell you how it goes. About 10 years, I'll call you back. We'll see how this works out.
Don't blame me. Not financial advice.
But actually, that's a good segue. Another question I had. You grew up in England, I believe, and of course, living and went to school, went to kind of university, and I think before that too, in the States. What you had a podcast a while back where you talked about kind of the difference in attitudes towards trying hard, failure, risk between England and America. And I'd never heard that before. Obviously, I didn't grow up in England, not very familiar with it. Anyway, could you talk about that a little bit, and maybe how it pertains to England, but also maybe some of the things that you think are unique to American business entrepreneurialism? Because I think sometimes people don't have, if you're living here, you grew up here your whole life, the U.S. has a ton of problems. We could talk about them for 4 hours and often do. But we also have some pretty cool advantages I think people sometimes miss.
So I was born and raised in London in the UK. I went to boarding school in America, and I went to university college in America. What I have found when people ask what are the main differences between the US and the UK, I think those differences are best exemplified by the grading systems that I experienced in school in either country. So in the US, you're graded A through F. People know that. In the UK, I got 2 grades. My first grade was an effort grade, ranked A through E. And my second grade was my attainment grade, ranked 1 through 6, 1 being the best, 6 being the worst. I think what you'd expect and what our teachers told us is that you want to get an A1. You want to do your work and put in the effort and get 100%. That's not what we wanted. That's not what the students wanted. The students wanted an E1. You wanted to be barely trying. You didn't put in any effort at all, and you're top of the class, and you got 100%. That was the best grade that you could get. And it sort of bred a culture of not trying, or more accurately, pretending not to try. So, maybe you want to walk into class a little bit late, or you want to hand in your homework late, or you want to be rude to the teacher. And it's all about kind of towing this line of how few damns can I give, while also being the best and achieving. And I think it's a real problem in the UK because it actually dampens ambition and willingness to try. In America, people try very hard and it's rewarded. You want to be rolling up your sleeves, working hard, grind culture. That's an important part of American culture. That's something that people respect. We don't respect laziness. In the UK, you look at Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson, I believe, is one of the best examples of E1. This is someone who went to Eton, who went to Oxford, and who later became the mayor of London, and who later became the prime minister. And he looked like he had just rolled out of bed every day. And that was all part of his shtick. He wanted to look disheveled. He wanted to look as if he wasn't trying. And the best story that I wish more people knew, but it was a story that was written in The Spectator about Boris Johnson that sort of captures this. And I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but it's interesting. So this writer was at this event called the Securitization Awards, whatever that is. And Boris Johnson was set to be a speaker. And half an hour goes by and Boris hasn't arrived. And everyone's like, what's happening? I mean, he's the keynote speaker. He bursts in 30 to 40 minutes late, right before he's supposed to speak. And he runs in and he's sort of out of breath and he sits down and he's like, writer, what are we talking about today? And everyone's kind of like, oh my God, like, this guy's the speaker. Like, how does he not know? And they're like, well, this is the securitization awards. The what? What is this? He doesn't know where he's at. And, this writer in The Spectator, I forget his name, is seeing this and he's very concerned. And they say, yes, and you're supposed to speak. He's, I'm supposed to speak. Well, gosh, righto. All right, then. He takes out a piece of paper and he scribbles the word sheep at the top and below that the word shock. And he's kind of looking at that like, why, what does that mean? He finally gets up there and he says he doesn't know where he is. And he says, good to be here at the, and then he turns around and he looks behind him, reads what the event is, the Securitization Awards. Oh, sorry. And everyone's kind of like laughing. Wow, he doesn't know where he is. He says, today I want to talk about, let's talk about sheep. And he tells some strange rambling joke about sheep that doesn't really make sense, but it's so strange and funny and eclectic that people like it and people kind of laugh. And then he goes on and he tells a joke about the mayor from the movie Jaws. And again, sort of running into this in his head. And then he says, and the third point I'd like to make is, well, gosh, I've forgotten the third point. And everyone loves it. They erupt into laughter and applause, and people love how he just kind of seems to be shooting from the hip, doesn't really know what he's talking about, doesn't really know where he is. He's sort of improvising, and it was fun, and people enjoyed it. Okay. 12 months later, this same writer is at another award ceremony, the Insurance Awards. Boris Johnson is the keynote speaker. Boris Johnson has not arrived 30 minutes in, 40 minutes past. Boris Johnson bursts into the room, out of breath, walks in. Where am I? What's happening? He doesn't know where he is. They say, well, this is the Insurance Awards. Oh, the Insurance Awards. And who's speaking? What's going on? Well, you're speaking. You're about to speak in 10 minutes. Oh, my gosh. Pulls out the piece of paper, performatively looks around. At the top of the piece of paper, he writes sheep. Below that, he writes sharks. Gets up on stage. Good to be looks around the Insurance Awards, tells a story about the sheep, tells a story about the shark, the mayor of Jaws. And he says, my third point is, oh, I've forgotten the third point. So what this, I believe, shows is everyone in England, and I'm sorry to do such a long story about Boris, but we're all manicuring how unmanicured we are, how off the cuff we are, how much we didn't try. And it does lead to people like Boris Johnson, who was one of the worst leaders we've ever had, being in charge. I think and I hope that we're about to see kind of a culture shift. I think the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is very different. He grew up working class. His mother was a nurse. His father was a tool maker. I think people have had enough with this "we don't really care" thing. But it's something that it has existed for centuries in Britain. And I think it's why you see a serious lack of entrepreneurship in the UK, because it's kind of embarrassing to say, I'm going to try really hard and start a company. If you're going to start a company, you're going to be trying, and you're going to be presenting to the rest of your peers that you are grinding really, really hard. That's not sexy in the UK. That's very sexy in the US. Sorry for such a long, rambling speech, but I think that's sort of the difference.
No, interesting. I mean, your story was, it's shockingly illustrative of, if it's happening at that level, at the topmost level in England, it's got to be something that's just not a one-off. I do think America, I've come over the years to, you look at our bankruptcy laws, which are kind of created to let people be able to fail without just, bankruptcy, I've never gone through it. I'm sure it's catastrophic and incredibly painful, but you're not going to jail for it. You're not, for most cases, most debt, you're not going to be in debt till you're 95, right? It's a environment that allows you to fail and be able to, at least over a little time, be able to rebuild something, which encourages innovation. I think we got into the war on the young. We didn't really get into kind of some of the issues with young men, which I'm not sure if we'll have time to or not. But one thing that my mind has been changed about recently is the minimum wage. For a while, I used to take a very strict kind of, my brother is a PhD in economics, and so we'll argue about this. He would say, I think a lot of economists would say just, minimum wage should be cleared by the market, right? Whatever it is, if you can pay people $5 an hour to work, great, not a problem. But I feel man, we want to have a country that honors work, that honors hard work, that makes it noble, that makes it something that is, that people are drawn to. And I think if we have a little bit of inefficiency loss in order to allow people, if they're willing to work, to at least, have some level of, maybe not they're going to have a living wage in, Manhattan, but somewhere, I think that's something that's pretty worth considering. Anyway, thanks for sharing that about England, and it's cool to, anything else that you've noticed about, and maybe without throwing England under the bus, but just in general about America that you think people don't appreciate? I've got maybe one anecdote, but I'm curious, you have a broader perspective than I do.
Well, I think your minimum wage point is a very important one. And I think that what America has prided itself on for the past couple of 100 years is that it rewards hard work. That's something that we respect. And it has made for an incredible, productive society. So when we start, splitting hairs over what the minimum wage should be, means we're in trouble. We should 100% be increasing minimum wage if it is literally flat against productivity, which has gone up like this. It's been exponential. And minimum wage hasn't moved. And I think that is the first sign of a stagnating society that is saying to its people, we don't really care about working hard, and we're not really going to reward it. And to kind of link it to your question about the UK, this is what happened in the UK. This was an aristocratic society where, it came from the feudal system, where you had a handful of families, where that used to be called the leisure class. The job of an aristocrat wasn't to work. It was lower class to work as an aristocrat. Your job was to go hunting. It was to play polo. It was to play tennis. Doing anything that required hard work was lower class. And it's resulted in the society that I have described to you that is not productive, and that really rests on its laurels. And the way that we have figured it out in the meantime in the UK is to have very favorable tax laws for rich foreign people. And we just ship them in, they park their money in there. We are the money laundering capital of the world. And that's the way that we have sustained that lifestyle. But I do believe that America risks running into similar problems where you rest on your laurels, you sit back and you think, well, my home price is going to keep going up, so I can just sit around and have fun and wait for the Social Security check to come in. That's not what made America great. What made America great is hard work and rewarding that hard work and encouraging people to embrace grinding and building something and rolling up your sleeves and putting in the hours. And I think that the minimum wage is, directly to your point, a great way to reward that, both financially, we should 100% be rewarding that, but also symbolically. That's something that we should take pride in. Yes, we reward people who work hard.
Yeah, I think, and look at America, again, so many great things with it, but also we've got there's a lot of major issues that are coming to a head, I think, in the next 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
And it would be so refreshing to see a political candidate. We don't really talk politics on the show too much, but without getting too much in the weeds, I think this is pretty universal. It'd be so refreshing to see a candidate come on and ask for a sense of shared sacrifice from everybody to be able to do something. If you're old and I know people, I've had conversations with seniors who are like, listen, I paid into Social Security for 40 years but I don't care what the state of the nation is. I want my Social Security check come hell or high water. Right. And then you have young people too, who also, there are some sacrifices as well, like national service. I think you guys talk about this on the podcast. I think that'd be phenomenal, for both for community, for hard work, for a sense of ownership over the nation. I can't remember the last time I heard any politician ask for sacrifice, right? And I think if you looked at one of the things too, like you talk about, like these "Eat the Rich" kind of stickers, I see them popping up sometimes, and they're kind of a little disturbing, because you're right. Like if you have a class of younger people, and especially like men, that are feeling like their prospects are waning and they just don't have any hope, that is not dangerous. Well for it's super dangerous. I mean, it leads to a lot of instability politically. So I'd love to see someone who came and called for shared sacrifice across the board. Cause man, it doesn't sell as well, but if you're rich, you and Scott talk about how and maybe Scott says this, most of the people he sees that are really wealthy, it's easy to stereotype them as like, evil money grubbing people that are just out to, screw everyone else at their expense. But his point is that's not usually the case from his point. Like a lot of people that are wealthy have gotten there by building allies, by adding value. And so if you could undemonize the rich, if you could ask the rich to contribute more, if you could convince them also that like those funds were going to be used for, productive purposes, I think that's another big thing. I am personally much more likely to pay more in taxes if I feel like that money isn't going to go to buy, 5,000th, F-16 fighter jet that's going to sit on the, the dock somewhere. But if it goes into education, it goes to something productive where there's an actual ROI on it. So anyway, this is my rant. It's saying just like, I would love to have more reasonable politicians that ask for shared kind of sacrifice.
100%. I think the trouble, I mean, you mentioned it, it's a hard thing to sell. The trouble is that politics is a popularity contest. And so the trouble with living in a democratic society is that you have to do and say the thing that's going to sell, and telling everyone, hey, let's all make our lives a little bit shittier for someone else to have a slightly better life is a very, very difficult message to sell. I always say the Democrats are progressive, left-leaning parties are always at a natural disadvantage because they have the burden of saying, please pay us more. That's a very hard position to start out at. And so it requires incredibly smart, clear, concise messaging to get people on board with that. I think Scott has done a really good job. If anyone hasn't seen his TED Talk, they should, where he starts out with a question of, do we love our children? Mm-hmm. Maybe you don't want to make your own life shittier for some random person, but you'd be down to sacrifice something for your child. And that's the conversation that we should be having. And to your point about productive policies not buying the 5,000th F1 fighter jet, one proposal that Andrew Yang made back in 2020, which I thought was a very great, nice, simple proposal, is that once you send in your taxes, you should get a video from your local government and perhaps also your federal government showing you where your taxes were put to work. We built this road with this amount of money. We, increased this water supply. We cleaned up this neighborhood. If you could see for yourself why your taxes are actually having a positive impact, not just on other people, but on your own life. If you can see that the reason why this building isn't collapsing is because we paid someone to come in here and check the foundations on an annual basis. And if we hadn't done that, the ceiling could have fallen on your head. I think that would be a lot more motivating. And I think that the government does a very bad job of showing you why it's a good thing for you to pay more in taxes, potentially. And we can also argue whether they are actually putting the money towards productive uses. But if we're a bit more transparent about it, I would hope that eventually it is more productive.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful in the senses that you mentioned, but I think it would also bring a lot more accountability, because I think they're just, anytime you have a government, there's always tons of government waste. It's interesting. I always love chatting with Uber drivers whenever I'm coming to and from airports, because they have such a unique perspective. And recently I was in Chicago and I was chatting with an Uber driver there, and he was an immigrant, like many Uber drivers are. But we started talking about politics, and he actually was he wasn't pro-Trump, but he was very, very pro-immigration reform, even as an immigrant, because he felt he came here and he felt like he's from Africa, excuse me. And he's like, I spent 3-4 years trying to get here legally, and it was so hard. And it's just crazy to me what's happening. And then also on the other side, like, he was not a rich man. But he also talked about how it's such a cool nuance, or an interesting nuance, because he talked about in some instances where he saw social programs be very beneficial. But then he also talked about a lot of instances in his community where he saw social programs getting milked, and just, people who would not work because they were on the government dime. And I think that's one of the things that, from a reasonable politician standpoint, I'd love to see is an acknowledgement of both sides. I feel like so often it's either we have to help everybody with no accountability, or we're not going to help anybody no matter what. Right. And I think the acknowledgement of, like, hey, we should help people who really need it. We should also make sure, like, programs aren't abused. And yeah, we should pay more in taxes, but we need to make sure that, like, other people are also using those tax funds really responsibly. And it's a hard thing to do, and it's very nuanced. And like you said, it's hard to sell people on paying more
Exactly.
taxes. But I feel like that's like the nuanced kind of perspective we need, because it's so rarely it's either A or B, and it's usually the world is not that black and white.
100%. The only thing I know to be true is that everything is way more complex than it seems.
Yes.
That's all I know. I could look at anything. I mean, everything, and it drives me, and I'm shocked that people don't fully grasp that. That people do want to see things in total black and white, despite the fact that all of the evidence shows nothing is black and white. But it's again, it's a question of messaging. I am confident and hopeful that we will find a leader who can make the points that you have made in a way that is clear and digestible for everyone, not just for people who listen to podcasts. But I think it's going to take, a real storyteller, a real hero to come in and do that effectively.
Man, I don't know. Maybe we could do Galloway, Elson, 2026. Although you're a Brit, you wouldn't be able to. I don't know. Maybe is there a restriction on the VP level? I guess if you're going to be president.
That's a good question, actually. I should look into that. People are saying Scott Galloway for president. I've been seeing that more and more. And I just want to say, terrible idea. Let's not put him in office.
The man who knows him probably, just almost as well as his wife. Yeah,
exactly.
Take it for his word. Ed, this has been wonderful. We got just a few minutes left here. I've got a bunch more stuff I could dive into for hours, but we're not going to have time. But I do have a quick, 6 or so kind of rapid fire questions here. That's kind of a tradition on the show.
Okay.
What's one of your fondest memories from childhood?
Wow. I've never been asked that question. My grandfather just passed away last week.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been kind of thinking about that, and I'm not sure what this memory does or serves, but for some reason, the memory that's been in my head since that happened is I just remember him. And this is a guy who really had his shit together. I mean, doctor, neurologist. He was also a woodworker. He was always so he had everything under control in a way that I found really inspiring. And for some reason, I just have this image that I keep on seeing of him. We were biking past his house in Atlanta, Georgia, and he just had his arms out to the side horizontally, like wings spanned. And he was just kind of gliding from side to side. And it was so... I don't know where I'm going with this, but for some reason that's been in my head. I think to see someone who was so, had his shit so together, and to see him look so carefree at the same time, for some reason that's been resonating for me. And I'm not sure what to draw from that, but that's in my head.
Yeah, that's a beautiful image. I mean, if you get both of those, you've probably done a pretty good job with your life. So
right. Yeah.
Sorry about your grandpa. He sounds like a really cool guy.
Yeah, he was brilliant, but thank you. Appreciate
that. Your favorite Scott Galloway eccentricity, of which you could pick from probably about 100.
Oh my God.
You may need 4 or 5 minutes here, which we can edit.
I know.
So
yeah.
Take your time. There's a large library.
He really, really knows how to have a good time. To the point where he views it as a job almost. Like, I mean, just one example, we were at a conference we were doing the Pivot conference in Miami. And this was my first year working for him. So I'm still pretty scared of him. Like, I don't really understand his deal. I I admire him, but it's like I'm a little frightened by him. And he sort of put on this conference and he bankrolled the whole thing. He lost so much money on this conference because he wanted it to be crazy. And at the very end, he had this burlesque performance with this pole dancer who came sliding in from the ceiling, and we're all kind of drinking and having a good time. And he looks at us and he says, "Guys, come in." And he sort of gathers the little young squad of producers and me, his little analyst, and he pulls out very performatively an Amex Black card. And he sort of shows it to all. He says, "I want you to take this and I want you to spend as much fucking money as you can." So we were like, sort of thought he was joking. Oh, that's funny. And sort of said, no. He's like, no. And he shoves it in our face. Our producer, Claire, puts it in her hand, closes her hand shut. Go to a club, buy a table, and spend as much money as possible, which is exactly what we did. And it was one of the most formative colleague bonding experiences ever. But he literally treats it as a job, that we have one life. We better fucking live it up as much as we can. I think that's one thing I really appreciate about him.
And then after the club, you went and called some real estate brokers and see if they took Amex for any purchases,
exactly.
Right?
Exactly. I learned you can't buy a house with a credit card.
Oh, shoot. It's a shame. Could have set you up. Hardest part of your job, if you had to name one, apart from dealing with Scott, of course.
Right. Hardest part of my job. I think it's a little bit linked to what I was talking about earlier about finding the so what in your research. Mm-hmm. We record a podcast twice a week. We put out a newsletter. We put out presentations for companies and investors and brands. Figuring out the so what every week is difficult. You mentioned you want to find 6 to 7 topics that you really care about. I view it the same way, but I want to be figuring out a topic I care about once to twice to 3 times a week. And that can be difficult. You can get a little bit exhausted figuring out the so what in everything. Why do I care about this? Why does this mean something? And I think that's the part that is more difficult than doing all the reading and doing all the research, figuring out the why. Why do we care? I think that it's important, but I think it's something that takes a lot of practice.
Next one is our recurrent, slightly gauche question, but one I think is fascinating. We've probably asked 200 different guests on this. It's the recurring one. How much money in the bank is enough? And so you can answer this either one of 2 ways. You can answer either lump sum in the bank. I have 100 million, I have 10 million, I have 1 million. And not that I'm not going to make more money in the rest of my life, but this is how much that, I have. And if I make more, great. If not, I'm content with this. Or you can say an annual payment for life. I make, $500,000 a year. I make $150,000 a year, 2 million, whatever it is. You can take it, slice it up however you want, but how much money is enough?
This is boring and I hope you'll accept it, but I don't think there is a number because it is so dependent on your lifestyle. If you're living in New York City and you want to, and again, this is all dependent on the things that you want to be doing. Do you really like nice restaurants? Is that something you really enjoy and you want to be a part of your lifestyle? Do you really enjoy having an apartment where there are amenities and there's maybe a pool and there's maybe a gym? These are things that I think that you have to ask yourself, which things do I actually want in my life? And then you got to figure out your number from there. I think if you're living in New York, if you're living in Manhattan, and you want some of those things that I just described, and you're my age, I think you got to be making at the very least 6 figures, for sure. I think you want to be approaching $200,000 a year. But again, that's from a very small slice of life where prices are crazy, rent is crazy, and that's where you have to draw your number from. So it's a boring answer from me, but I really do think that you need to start with understanding which things do I really care about in my life and do I want, and roughly add that up, and then decide on your number from there. And then you can figure out what kinds of jobs are going to pay you that much.
Yeah. And you'll have to forgive me, kind of also as tradition, a lot of times people kind of will give a similar answer. And I owe it to the listeners to push at least once to ask them for their number. So I got to do it this time too. So for you at 25 living in New York, or even just in general, what would be enough from a salary or a money in the bank perspective?
200,000 for me.
200,000. Awesome.
Yeah. Thanks. Living in New York. I'm one of these people. I'm cursed with liking nice things.
You're the only one I've ever met.
I enjoy, similar to Scott, and probably because I've been, he gave me the black card, and now my expectations are ruined.
It seemed like a blessing, and it was a curse.
It was a curse. I like going out and going to clubs and having fun with friends, and I like going to nice restaurants. And I want to live in a nice place. These are all things that I want for myself, and I've set an expectation for myself. So that's where that comes from. If I was perfectly comfortable with, doing things that cost less money, then I'd reduce my number. But that's the lifestyle that I like right now. So that's my number right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for engaging on it. Last question for you. What's something you absolutely love to do and you can't say work? So if there's one thing you could be doing, and you're outside of work hours, you've got podcasts in the bag for the next month, what would you find yourself doing?
I love playing soccer. I love playing tennis. I love exercising. I try to do that. I exercise every day, and I try to play. I don't run because I find running boring. So I prefer to play sports. Yeah, exactly. So I try to play soccer, and I play tennis. I'm sure you probably hear that a lot. I think more important than anything to me is having exhilarating conversations with friends. It's the most important thing to me. That's when I probably feel most fulfilled, going out to dinner and having, a conversation where those conversations where it's like you both are pretty upset to leave. I used to, in boarding school, I remember staying up till 2, 3 in the morning, just chatting shit about whatever. And I would always sort of scold myself because I should have been doing my homework. But as I look back on it, those are so much more meaningful than anything else. So that's what I try to do. I think it's hard and you're working a lot, trying to make time for those. But I try to make sure I'm regularly seeing friends, regularly setting up an environment where we can have a good time. I think that's probably the most fun that I have outside of work.
Yeah. Ed, well, this has been a blast. Thank you so much for coming on, and your work with, yourself and with Scott on the show. I think it's, well beyond entertaining, of course, which it is. It's starting conversations and make people thinking about things and in ways that I think not many people do, and is super needed and important. So thank you for the work you do. You do an exceptionally amazing job on the show. And if you haven't listened to the show, the Prof G show, and also Prof G Markets. Prof G Markets is more focused on the business side. Prof G show is focused on business and tech, but also kind of a slightly wider range of topics. And make sure to give Ed a follow on Twitter as well. It's at Ed Elson. The O is, I believe, a 0 though, as well as
That's right.
7 O.
That's right. You nailed it. Wow. Thank you.
Yeah. And Ed, anything else you want to give a shout out to or promote or anything else at all before we sign off here?
No, I don't think so. Prof G Markets. I think you covered it. This is very fun. Really appreciate it and love the questions. This was a fun conversation similar to the one I was just describing with friends. This was great.
Yeah, thank you. Same, right back at you. Loved it, and maybe at some point in the future we can, after you wrap up your VP tour with Scott and things calm down a little bit, we can grab a meal and continue with something. I love that. So,
absolutely. Thanks so much, Andrew. This was fun.
Ed, thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.